40 years. That was how long the rusted shape had been sinking under the mud and weeds at the back of an abandoned, moss-covered stone farm. People walking past the sagging wooden fence often laughed to themselves. To them, the decaying metal consumed by earth was nothing more than forgotten, worthless junk. Nobody ever looked twice. The thick fog of the countryside seemed to swallow whatever remained of the vehicle, hiding it from the indifferent eyes of the locals. But Liam Miller, a 38-year-old restoration craftsman with a reputation for quiet precision, was the only man who did not smile when he looked at the ruin. He stood silently in the heavy mist, his worn denim jacket damp. His cold gray eyes carefully scanned the aggressive slope of the hood protruding from the earth. With bare hands, Liam pulled back the dense blackberry vines. He broke off sections of rotten wood, kneeling into the cold mud without a moment of hesitation. He directed a high-pressure water stream over the oxidized surface. The crust of 4 decades slowly began to peel away, revealing the curved profile beneath. Sliding onto the wet earth beneath the cabin, he shone a heavy flashlight into the lower cavity of the firewall. He knew exactly where to look. There it was, a factory-stamped sequence pressed directly into the steel frame. An original VIN, uncorrupted by time, verifying something no one had expected to find. Liam remained completely still. He pulled out his phone and took 3 clear photographs of the stamping, securing the physical evidence of a long-buried truth. Late that evening, inside his dimly lit stone workshop, Liam transferred the digital photographs to his old laptop. The flickering fluorescent overhead light cast deep shadows across his face. He spent hours cross-referencing the factory sequences. The alphanumeric stamping was an anomaly, a ghost in the manufacturing records that should not have existed outside internal archives. Knowing the magnitude of the discovery, Liam composed a formal email to Voss Auctions, the most prestigious appraisal institution in the region, attaching the physical evidence. He hit send and leaned back in his worn leather chair. The silence of the isolated workshop felt heavier now, charged with the weight of an unverified truth. Miles away, inside a grand oak-paneled office reeking of elite privilege, Charlotte Voss reviewed the incoming query. Her tailored suit and cold demeanor projected absolute institutional authority. Beside her stood Carter Hale, an appraisal critic who wore his expertise like a weapon. He glanced at Liam's muddy photographs and let out a dismissive, arrogant scoff. Without zooming in or verifying the structural context, Carter instructed Charlotte to send the standard rejection template. To them, it was just another delusion from a rural amateur. The ping of the reply echoed in Liam's quiet shop. He read the clinically polite words dismissing his vehicle as an advanced decayed production coupe of no value. Shortly after, an anonymous post appeared on an exclusive collector's forum. It mocked the unrealistic expectations of uneducated farm boys finding junk, clearly referencing Liam's submission. Liam read the public humiliation without a flinch. He did not slam the desk. He simply closed the laptop with slow, deliberate precision. The real work had just begun. Elena Vance, a 32-year-old investigative journalist, sat in her quiet study. The faint glow of her monitor reflected off her blonde hair as she read Carter's arrogant forum post. Unlike the others, she did not laugh. Her sharp eyes caught something the self-proclaimed experts had completely missed in the corner of the attached photograph. She saved the image and adjusted the contrast. The blurred pixels shifted, revealing the faint outline of a manufacturing code specific to a ghost production line. Elena knew the history of the industry better than most. The subtle curve of the metal and the misplaced digit pointed to an anomaly that should not exist. Without hesitation, she closed her laptop, threw on a heavy trench coat, and stepped out into the freezing midnight rain. The drive to the rural outskirts was long and treacherous. Thick fog clung to the winding country roads, masking the approach to the forgotten stone farm. Back inside the isolated workshop, Liam was already working. The heavy clanking of iron chains echoed as he prepared to lift the rusted engine block. The rhythmic sound of the pouring rain was suddenly broken by the crunch of gravel. Liam paused, his grease-stained hands resting on the cold steel. Elena stepped out of her vehicle. The heavy raindrops hit her coat as she stood before the imposing wooden doors of the old workshop, her expression resolute. The massive door slowly creaked open. Liam stood in the dimly lit threshold. Two brilliant minds met in absolute silence, separated only by the cold mist. Elena stepped into the cavernous stone workshop. The smell of old oil and damp earth filled the air as she took off her dripping trench coat. Liam closed the heavy door behind her. He offered no polite greetings, and she expected none. They were driven by the same quiet obsession. Walking past the disorganized workbenches, Elena approached the rusted chassis. She completely ignored the thick grease staining her tailored clothes. Pulling a small penlight from her pocket, she leaned over the exposed firewall, shining the narrow beam directly onto the stamped alphanumeric sequence. She ran her manicured fingers over the cold, indented steel. When she finally looked up at Liam, she did not ask a question. She simply nodded. The unspoken alliance was formed. For the next several nights, the workshop became a sanctuary of meticulous, undocumented labor. Elena set up macro lenses, photographing every oxidized bolt and rubber date code with the surgical precision of a forensic investigator. Beside her, Liam dismantled the decaying components. His strong, calloused hands moved with a practiced grace, revealing the factory secrets hidden beneath the rust. Using her elite journalistic credentials, Elena drafted a secure, fast-tracked request to the Central Heritage Archives, bypassing the standard bureaucratic delays. As dawn approached, they stood side by side under the flickering shop lights. The undeniable chain of evidence was building piece by piece. 6 weeks passed in absolute silence. The heavy European fog never fully lifted around the stone workshop, concealing the momentous work happening inside. On a quiet Tuesday morning, the stillness was broken by the sharp, mechanical whir of an old fax machine sitting on Liam's dusty desk. A single piece of paper slowly fed through the rollers. At the top of the page, the official insignia of the Central Automotive Heritage Archives emerged. Liam picked up the warm sheet of paper. His cold gray eyes scanned the dense text, tracing the definitive proof of a ghost production line. When Elena arrived later that afternoon, Liam did not speak. He simply handed her the document, the physical weight of history resting in his palm. Elena read the broadcast sheet. The factory codes confirmed the impossible. A ZL1 aluminum block, assembled under a non-retail internal plant allocation. It was real. Meanwhile, miles away at a luxurious high society gala, Charlotte Voss and Carter Hale clinked crystal champagne glasses, utterly unaware of the shifting tides. Carter entertained a circle of elite collectors, his arrogant smirk widening as he recounted the tale of the delusional rural craftsman and his rusted junk. Back in the dimly lit workshop, Elena placed the certified document gently on the restored metal hood of the vehicle, locking the final piece into place. The evidence was now indisputable. Liam and Elena shared a silent, resolute look. The foundation of the elite's arrogance was about to crumble. Back in her modern study, Elena began drafting the framework of an explosive article. The truth could no longer remain confined to the dark workshop. She made discreet inquiries to independent appraisers to cross-reference the data, ensuring her journalistic foundation was absolutely impenetrable. But in the closed circles of the elite, whispers traveled quickly. Still at the luxurious European gala, Carter Hale received an unexpected phone call. The arrogant smirk instantly vanished from Carter's face. He stepped away from the crowd, his polished facade cracking under the weight of the news. He whispered the development to Charlotte Voss. Her elegant features hardened into a mask of cold calculation as the threat became real. They realized the rural craftsman possessed actual documentation. An unspoken decision was made in the shadows of the crystal chandeliers. The evidence had to be intercepted. Meanwhile, a quiet sense of approaching danger settled over the isolated workshop. Liam stood by the heavy wooden doors, locking the deadbolts. He walked over to the restored hood of the car, picking up the official broadcast sheet. He knew the paper record was the true target. Anticipating their next move, Liam placed a decoy folder of preliminary notes on the work desk, carefully folding the original certified document into his jacket pocket. He stepped out into the freezing night, driving away into the thick fog, taking the undeniable truth far away from the vulnerable stone walls. At 3 in the morning, a relentless downpour masked the sound of an unmarked vehicle arriving at the isolated stone workshop. Shadowy figures moved deliberately against the old walls. With practiced, silent precision, the heavy rear lock was forced open. The beam of a tactical flashlight cut through the damp interior. These were not opportunistic vandals. They moved with calculated purpose. Ignoring the expensive restoration tools lining the walls, the intruder stepped directly toward the rusted chassis of the Camaro. A gloved hand pressed a heavy metallic tool against the exposed firewall, aiming directly at the original alphanumeric sequence. The attempt was brief but forceful, leaving fresh, silver scratches across the deeply aged steel, though the factory stamping remained unyielding. Realizing the metal would not easily give way, the flashlight beam quickly swept toward Liam's cluttered wooden desk. The intruder seized the thick decoy folder Liam had carefully positioned, mistaking the preliminary notes for the undeniable archival proof. Miles away, in the quiet of his own home, Liam's phone screen lit up with a silent perimeter breach alert. He stared at the glowing notification in the dark bedroom. His face remained perfectly calm. The elite had taken the bait. The next morning, under a pale European sun, Liam arrived at his workshop. The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, the lock utterly destroyed. He walked inside, his boots crunching lightly on the concrete. He glanced at the empty space on his desk where the decoy folder had been. Approaching the vehicle, Liam ran his thumb over the fresh, silver scratches on the firewall. The original stamping remained perfectly intact. Elena arrived shortly after. She surveyed the forced entry and the missing documents, her sharp eyes calculating the implications. Without a word, Liam reached into his heavy jacket and produced the original, sealed broadcast sheet, completely unharmed. They mutually agreed to bypass the authorities. A police report would only create the bureaucratic delay their adversaries desperately needed. Elena returned to her office, fueled by the rising stakes. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, finalizing an article built on undeniable facts. She did not make wild accusations. Instead, she published a meticulously structured piece asking how authenticity could be denied without physical inspection. The article spread like wildfire across digital platforms, catching the immediate attention of independent collectors and industry veterans. In her immaculate office, Charlotte Voss read the headline on her tablet. Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened around the device in silent dread. The fallout was immediate. Carter Hale watched his digital forum flood with demanding questions. Unable to control the narrative, his account abruptly went silent. Attempting to manage the crisis, Charlotte Voss quickly arranged an appearance on a high-profile collector's podcast, broadcasting from her elite office. Her voice remained smooth and assured. She spoke at length about the supposed dangers of unverified enthusiasm and the necessity of institutional process. In his quiet workshop, Liam listened to the broadcast. He did not react to her subtle insults. Instead, he carefully placed his certified documents into a thick leather folder. The morning of the annual Heritage Automotive Symposium arrived. The venue was a magnificent, classical European conference hall, adorned with towering stone columns. The grand lobby buzzed with elite collectors and journalists. Elena's article had loaded the atmosphere with heavy, unspoken tension. Liam drove to the event alone. He parked his worn classic truck at the far end of the luxurious lot, completely out of place among the pristine modern vehicles. He walked toward the grand entrance holding the leather folder under his arm. He wore a clean, simple dark jacket, standing in stark contrast to the tailored suits around him. Inside the opulent panel room, Charlotte and Carter took their seats on the raised stage. They projected a carefully manufactured aura of absolute authority. Without drawing any attention, Liam entered the massive room. He quietly found an empty seat in the third row, sat down, and waited for the session to begin. Charlotte opened the panel with practiced composure. She addressed the packed room, projecting an illusion of absolute control over the narrative surrounding the controversial viral article. Carter Hale sat to her right, nodding in agreement. He warned the audience about the dangers of forged documents and the rising threat of amateur sentimentality. From the third row, Liam watched them with a cold, unreadable expression. His strong hands rested patiently on the dark leather folder resting on his lap. The atmosphere shifted when Isaac Barrow, a highly respected veteran collector, raised his hand from the back of the room, cutting through the orchestrated presentation. With a heavy, authoritative voice, Isaac demanded to know why Voss Auctions had dismissed the vehicle without ever conducting a physical inspection. Charlotte attempted a managed retreat into institutional language, stating that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and dismissing the article as mere speculation. That was the exact moment Liam stood up. He did not shout or wait for permission. The leather folder remained firmly under his arm. The heavy silence in the massive hall was broken only by the sound of Liam's boots stepping deliberately down the central aisle toward the raised stage. Charlotte's perfectly composed face faltered for a fraction of a second as she recognized the rural craftsman approaching her elite panel. Reaching the front, Liam calmly opened the thick leather folder and placed the certified, sealed broadcast sheet directly onto the table, right in front of them. The massive conference hall fell into a heavy, breathless silence. Hundreds of attendees leaned forward, watching the confrontation on the raised stage with absolute focus. Charlotte Voss picked up the top document. Her professional composure masked her internal panic as her eyes scanned the undeniable, authenticated seals from the Heritage Archives. She passed the paper to Carter Hale without a single word. Carter held the document for a moment longer than necessary, his manicured fingers trembling slightly. Desperate to salvage his reputation, Carter stated that an archival paper was merely a starting point, demanding a physical inspection to prevent elaborate fraud. Liam nodded in calm agreement. He did not need a microphone. He spoke with a flat, unwavering clarity that carried perfectly across the quiet room. He announced that 2 recognized authentication bodies were scheduled to inspect the vehicle at his workshop the following Wednesday, with full press access already arranged. Before Carter could respond, Isaac Barrow's deep voice echoed from the audience. The veteran collector declared the documents looked flawlessly legitimate. Isaac noted that the real tragedy was not the forgotten car, but the deeply arrogant institutional process that had forced this public confrontation. The texture of the silence shifted. Recognizing her complete defeat, Charlotte placed the documents neatly on the table, folding her hands in total submission. From the front row, Elena Vance raised her professional camera. The shutter clicked rapidly, forever capturing the exact moment the elite facade shattered. His work finished, Liam turned his back on the stage. He walked out of the massive hall, the crowd parting to give him a wide, respectful path. Stepping out into the bright afternoon sun, he returned to his old truck. He drove away from the opulent venue, leaving the shattered elite behind. The following Wednesday arrived crisp and clear. The heavy fog surrounding the stone workshop had finally lifted, mirroring the clarity of the impending truth. 2 professional vehicles pulled up to the muddy perimeter. Senior inspectors from the most respected independent authentication bodies stepped out, carrying heavy technical equipment. Liam waited by the open wooden doors. There were no arrogant smiles or defensive postures, only the quiet, mutual respect of dedicated craftsmen. Inside, the workshop was meticulously organized. The rusted car chassis sat center stage, illuminated by bright, surgical overhead lights. By prior agreement, Elena Vance was the only press allowed. She sat quietly on a wooden stool in the corner, her pen poised over a fresh notebook. The intensive process began. The senior inspectors produced their own thick reference binders, verifying every detail with intense, methodical scrutiny. For hours, they used specialized magnifying loupes and harsh lights to cross-reference the physical engine cast numbers against the archival broadcast sheet. Liam did not hover or interfere. He stood near his workbench, calmly holding a cup of black coffee, watching the truth confirm itself in the steel. As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the stone workshop, the grueling physical inspection finally reached its conclusion. The lead inspector removed his magnifying loupe and cotton gloves. He looked at Liam, his expression shifting from clinical focus to profound professional respect. Placing a heavy brass stamp onto a pristine sheet of paper, the inspector formally signed the official certificate of authenticity. The final determination was absolute. Every authenticated point of the physical record matched the archival broadcast sheet perfectly. The vehicle was a factory original ZL1. Sitting in the corner, Elena Vance immediately opened her laptop. She did not need to ask questions this time. She only needed to report the definitive facts. 48 hours later, her follow-up article went live. It cited the independent authentication organizations by name, cementing the truth into the public record. The impact was devastating to the elite critics. Carter Hale's widely followed forum account went completely silent, rapidly deleting itself into digital oblivion. Inside her immaculate European office, Charlotte Voss faced the undeniable reality of her failure. With a heavy sigh, she picked up her sleek desk phone. Liam answered the call in his quiet workshop. Charlotte delivered a brief, calculated statement, formally acknowledging that Voss Auctions had arrived at an incorrect initial assessment. She offered to conduct the eventual auction under full transparency protocols. Liam thanked her with flat politeness, said he would think about it, and calmly ended the call. The offer of a Voss auction was left hanging in the cold air of the workshop, discarded as easily as a rusted bolt. Liam had no interest in their brand of validation. A curator from the Detroit Museum of Automotive History contacted Elena. They sought the vehicle not for its market valuation, but for its historical soul. Liam met the curator in the center of his shop. The man was unassuming, dressed in a simple wool blazer, far removed from the polished suits of the gala. They spent hours discussing the car's provenance. Liam walked him through the physical evidence, his voice calm, detailing the life of the machine from factory line to field. Liam proposed the terms: a long-term loan for exhibition. He would retain full ownership, but the museum would provide a secure, climate-controlled space. The curator agreed instantly, but Liam had one final, non-negotiable condition that the museum head would have to sign into the loan agreement. He dictated two names: his great-grandfather, a line worker who had once stood on the factory floor, and Harold, the man who had kept the secret. The curator scribbled the names onto a legal pad, confirming they would be immortalized on the museum's official brass display plate. Days later, a specialized transport truck arrived. The car was carefully loaded, its rusted, authentic profile looking oddly majestic against the sterile white van. Liam watched the transport truck drive away. The workshop felt vast and empty, but for the first time in his life, the weight of the silence felt like peace. The storm clouds over the Voss Auctions empire finally broke, but not in favor of its directors. Public scrutiny turned into a tidal wave of skepticism. She dialed Liam's number, her hand hovering briefly before pressing the call button. The silence on the other end was heavy with the weight of her defeat. She delivered a cold, rehearsed statement, acknowledging that her firm had failed to conduct a proper inspection, effectively admitting her institutional negligence. Liam listened to her proposal in the silence of his workshop. He watched the rain begin to fall once more, tapping against the stone exterior. Charlotte proposed a solution: an exclusive auction hosted by Voss under full transparency, promising Liam total control over the proceedings to regain his trust. With flat, unwavering politeness, Liam declined the offer. He expressed no bitterness, only a simple, resolute rejection of her institutional validation. The line went silent as Charlotte struggled to process his refusal. She was a woman who was used to hearing yes from everyone in her circle. Liam carefully placed his mobile phone back onto the workbench. The conversation had ended exactly as he had planned, on his own terms. He walked toward the center of his shop, the empty space where the car once sat staring back at him. The victory was quiet, profound, and entirely his own. For the first time in his life, the weight of the silence felt like peace. The truth had finally been told, and he was finally free. With the auction offer dismissed, Liam turned his attention to the final disposition of the vehicle. He sought a path that prioritized history over commercial exploitation. A curator from the Detroit Museum of Automotive History contacted Elena. They sought the vehicle not for its market valuation, but for its historical soul. The museum board met within days. They recognized that a factory-original ZL1 of this provenance was an industrial artifact of profound national significance. Liam attended the board meeting in Detroit. He sat across from a panel of historians, his presence commanding a quiet, professional respect from everyone present. He presented the authenticated documents. The museum board examined the seals, their faces reflecting the gravity of the rare, undocumented machinery they were viewing. Terms were finalized with simple, ironclad clarity. The museum would maintain the car in a climate-controlled exhibition hall, accessible to the public for generations. Liam's only condition remained unchanged. The interpretive panel for the display was to strictly feature the names of his ancestors who had protected it. The curator scribbled the names onto a legal pad, confirming they would be immortalized on the museum's official brass display plate. Days later, a specialized transport truck arrived. The car was carefully loaded, its rusted, authentic profile looking oddly majestic against the sterile white van. Liam watched the transport truck drive away. The workshop felt vast and empty, but for the first time in his life, the weight of the silence felt like peace. The offer of a Voss auction was left hanging in the cold air of the workshop, discarded as easily as a rusted bolt. Liam had no interest in their brand of validation. A curator from the Detroit Museum of Automotive History contacted Elena. They sought the vehicle not for its market valuation, but for its historical soul. Liam met the curator in the center of his shop. The man was unassuming, dressed in a simple wool blazer, far removed from the polished suits of the gala. They spent hours discussing the car's provenance. Liam walked him through the physical evidence, his voice calm, detailing the life of the machine from factory line to field. Liam proposed the terms: a long-term loan for exhibition. He would retain full ownership, but the museum would provide a secure, climate-controlled space. The curator agreed instantly, but Liam had one final, non-negotiable condition that the museum head would have to sign into the loan agreement. He dictated two names: his great-grandfather, a line worker who had once stood on the factory floor, and Harold, the man who had kept the secret. The curator scribbled the names onto a legal pad, confirming they would be immortalized on the museum's official brass display plate. Days later, a specialized transport truck arrived. The car was carefully loaded, its rusted, authentic profile looking oddly majestic against the sterile white van. Liam watched the transport truck drive away. The workshop felt vast and empty, but for the first time in his life, the weight of the silence felt like peace. The legal transfer was finalized in a sterile, glass-walled conference room. Liam signed the documents, his hand steady, ensuring the car would reside where it could be studied. The museum curator presented a draft of the brass display plate. It featured the two names Liam had demanded: his ancestor and the guardian, Harold. A specialized, climate-controlled transport vehicle arrived at the workshop at dawn. The air was cold, carrying the sharp scent of an approaching winter. Workers in white protective gear moved with surgical care. The rusted, authentic body of the Camaro was hoisted into the secure containment unit of the truck. Liam stood by the threshold of his workshop watching the process. He did not step forward to help. He maintained a quiet, observational distance. The transport unit was sealed with heavy industrial locks. The machine that had spent 40 years in darkness was finally departing for the light of historical record. As the truck engine rumbled to life, the vibrations echoed against the stone walls of the workshop. The sound was deep, rhythmic, and strangely final. Liam watched the vehicle pull away from the gravel lot. It turned onto the main road, its taillights disappearing into the thick, rolling morning mist. The workshop floor stood vacant. The intense overhead lights, which had revealed every secret of the car's assembly, were finally switched off. Liam stepped out into the open air, locking the heavy workshop doors for the final time. The silence that remained was not empty. It was pure. With the transport truck finally gone, the stone workshop settled into a profound, heavy silence. Liam walked back inside, the echoes of his footsteps sounding foreign in the empty space. He moved to the workbench where the car had sat for months. He gathered the last of his research notes, documenting the final chapter of the project. Elena arrived shortly after. She did not speak, sensing that Liam needed to process the physical absence of the machine that had defined his life. They sat in the dim light of the workshop, discussing the final museum exhibition. It was no longer a personal obsession. It was now a public, historical legacy. The museum director sent a follow-up email confirming the safe arrival of the ZL1. The car was already being prepped for the archival display in Detroit. Liam read the message on his phone. There was no surge of triumph, only a quiet, grounded satisfaction that the long ordeal had achieved its proper end. He began the process of cleaning the workshop. He swept the concrete floor, removing every trace of grease, mud, and the remnants of the restoration. Elena helped him box up the remaining tools. Their collaboration had been forged in necessity, but it had left a permanent imprint on both their lives. The workshop, once a site of intense, secret investigation, was now just a quiet stone structure. The secret had been replaced by a historical truth. Liam turned off the main power breaker. As the workshop plunged into darkness, he knew that the history he had unearthed would never be lost again. Months later, the Detroit Museum of Automotive History opened its grand winter exhibition. The event drew hundreds of international historians and collectors. At the center of the main hall, the authenticated ZL1 rested on a pristine white pedestal, illuminated by dramatic, angled spotlights. The crowd of attendees moved slowly around the perimeter of the display, observing the raw, unpolished industrial artifact with absolute reverence. Embedded at the base of the platform was a heavy, polished brass interpretive plate, gleaming under the museum lights. The text on the metal strictly detailed the factory specifications, followed prominently by the two names Liam had mandated, the original line worker and herald. Elena Vance stood near the back of the room. She watched the attendees reading the plaque, confirming her journalistic work had permanently altered the historical record. Far from the exhibition, inside a dim, empty bar, Carter Hale watched a news segment covering the museum opening on a small television screen. He sat alone, his previous arrogance entirely erased. He looked away from the broadcast, his influence within the collector community completely dissolved. Across the city, Charlotte Voss was actively emptying her grand oak-paneled office. She placed her personal items into a standard cardboard box. The powerful auction house had quietly restructured its leadership. The institutional arrogance that once defined her career had collapsed into quiet irrelevance. Winter settled over the rural stone workshop. The heavy snow blanketed the fields, bringing a profound sense of quiet to the isolated property. Inside, Liam returned to his craft. He stood over a new rusted chassis, his hands moving with the same methodical grace as before. His phone rang continuously on the wooden bench. Elite collectors from across the continent were now desperate for his uncorrupted, undeniable expertise. He ignored the incoming calls. He did not seek their validation, choosing to accept only the projects that required genuine, honest restoration. In the city, Elena Vance walked through the bustling newsroom. Her groundbreaking article had secured her position as the industry's most formidable investigative voice. Colleagues parted ways for her, offering nods of professional respect. The institutional gatekeepers who once dismissed her now feared her sharp scrutiny. She packed her leather briefcase at the end of the day. Without hesitation, she bypassed the corporate celebrations, choosing a different destination. Back at the workshop, Liam's 15-year-old daughter, Grace, entered the dimly lit room. She walked silently toward her father's cluttered wooden desk. She picked up a framed photograph of the museum display plate. Her young eyes traced the engraved names of the ancestors who had protected their legacy. Liam looked up from his work. He nodded at his daughter, a silent acknowledgement of the generational weight that had finally been properly honored. As the winter snow melted, spring brought a renewed sense of life to the isolated stone workshop. The heavy isolation slowly gave way to a quiet renewal. In Detroit, the museum exhibition became a permanent fixture. The rusted ZL1 stood definitively as a monument to working-class preservation, untouched by commercial greed. Elena Vance attended an industry banquet. She accepted a prestigious journalism award for her uncompromising integrity and relentless investigative rigor. Unlike the elites she had exposed, Elena did not gloat. She delivered a brief, professional speech thanking those who protect historical truths in silence. Conversely, Carter Hale's reality continued to fracture. Desperate to cover mounting debts, he was forced to liquidate his private automotive collection. He watched silently in a dim garage as his prized vehicles were loaded onto transport trucks, his once untouchable empire reduced to a desperate clearance sale. At Voss Auctions, the corporate board officially erased Charlotte's legacy. A young, ruthless executive took her place in the grand oak-paneled office. The new director immediately discarded the old traditions, openly prioritizing algorithmic profit over the human element of automotive history. Far removed from that sterile world, Liam completed his latest restoration project. It was a simple, honest machine intended for an ordinary family. He handed the keys to the grateful local owner. There were no cameras, no press releases, just the quiet satisfaction of a job done perfectly. Months later, Liam traveled to Detroit, entering the Grand Museum as an ordinary visitor, his presence entirely unnoticed by the crowd. He stood at the back of the exhibition hall, watching a father and son marvel at the rusted ZL1 on its illuminated white pedestal. The young boy pointed at the heavy brass plate, reading the names of Liam's ancestors aloud with genuine, uncorrupted awe. Liam did not step forward to claim credit. The quiet realization that his family's legacy was finally safe was all the reward he needed. Back in the city, Elena Vance closed her office door, her investigative board already filled with notes for a new, untold truth. The elite world of Carter and Charlotte faded into irrelevant history, their arrogant empires dismantled by a single, undeniable physical fact. Liam returned to the rural roads, driving his old pickup truck through the lush, green spring landscape toward home. He pulled into the gravel driveway of the stone workshop, greeted by the warm, proud smile of his daughter, Grace. The workshop was no longer a fortress of secrets. It was a place of honest labor, bright, welcoming, and deeply peaceful. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Liam and Grace stood together. The 40-year dialogue of the buried machine was finally, beautifully complete.